Hello, I am Thomas Cunningham and I am the chair of the 2020 Program Committee. I hope you are enjoying all that this week's ASBH conference has to offer thus far. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's plenary session, which you may recognize as a topic that is intrinsically connected with Baltimore and was conceived of when we all thought we'd be sitting in a large conference room in the heart of Baltimore. Although we are not together in the Charm City, the themes of structural injustice, social injustice, and bioethics continue to be exceptionally relevant today, even more so than when the panelists proposed this presentation. While we knew that this panel would certainly build on our conference theme of justice and flourishing in a pluralistic world, we could not have imagined how central discussions of justice would become in the months after our initial planning. As moderator, Jeffrey Kahn will lead us through an examination of social justice and bioethics through the lens of issues raised by the story of Henrietta Lacks and the HeLa cell line derived from her cells. The esteemed panelists, Ruth Faden, Jerry Lacks, Victor Vines, and Patricia King will discuss structural injustice from the perspective of the Lacks family, law, social justice, and legacy. Welcome to Dr. Kahn, and thanks to all of you for agreeing to participate today.
Hello, everybody. This is Jeffrey Kahn. I am director of the Johns Hopkins Berman Institute of Bioethics, and it's my pleasure to welcome everyone to this plenary session entitled Social Justice and Bioethics Through the Lens of the Story of Henrietta Lacks. This session was originally planned as the opening plenary for this year's meeting, with a focus on social justice, the story of Henrietta Lacks, and Baltimore. But while we're not in Baltimore or in person at this year's meeting, the topic of this session is more important, and I would say more relevant than ever, with Black Lives Matter protests that began this summer and renewed attention and focus to social justice and structural racism and inequality. This year is also the 100th anniversary of the birth of Mrs. Lacks, and appropriate to both that anniversary and our renewed efforts to challenge systemic racism, I thought I would introduce our session with a short quote from an article remembering the legacy of Henrietta Lacks, just published in the September 15th issue of JAMA, authored by Francis Collins, the director of the National Institutes of Health, and Carrie Wolinitz, the NIH Deputy Director for Science Policy. The quote reads as follows: "Today's current events provide an opportune time to reflect on the experience of the Lacks family and other African Americans in the context of biomedical research, and to look ahead to what can be done to make that future far more just and equitable. Solving the issues of inequities in clinical research and ultimately in healthcare and medicine is going to require the recognition and remediation of systemic racism throughout the enterprise. It will not be a simple undertaking. It will require a commitment to substantive change, disruption of the status quo, and a willingness to admit complicity in an unjust system." We could have no better panel to talk about these issues than the four who join me today. And we will begin with my friend and colleague, Professor Ruth Faden. Ruth Faden is the founder of the Johns Hopkins Berman Institute of Bioethics and was its director from 1995 until 2016, when I became director. She is also the Philip Franklin Wagley Professor of Biomedical Ethics. Her research focuses on structural injustice theory and public policy, and currently Dr. Faden is working at the intersection of structural justice and the COVID-19 pandemic response, primarily in vaccine allocation and prioritization and K-12 education. Thank you, Ruth, for being here.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you for this opportunity to be on this panel. And I just want to say at the outset, it is always an honor and a privilege to be on a panel with a member of the Lacks family. So thank you so much, Jerry, for yet another chance to do so. My job on this panel is to begin our conversation by shining an explicit justice lens on the story of Mrs. Lacks, her husband and children, and HeLa cells. I think it's safe to assume that everyone is familiar with that story, so I'm going to begin by reprieving only a few of the elements of particular relevance to a justice lens. Next slide, please. This is one of my favorite images of Mrs. Lax with her husband David, nicknamed Day, taken when she was still well, fortunately. So quickly on the story. In 1950, Henrietta Lax was a poor African-American woman who had recently moved with her family to Baltimore, Maryland, as part of the great Black urban migration of that era, from the rural South to what was hoped for economic opportunity in cities. In the case of Baltimore, the opportunities were in the shipbuilding business. At the time, Mrs. Lax was a young mother of 5 with little formal education. She was becoming progressively more ill with pain in her lower abdomen and eventually went to Johns Hopkins Hospital for treatment. In 1951, Hopkins was the only hospital in the region that provided medical care to African Americans. Baltimore was, nevertheless, very much a southern city at that time, a southern city of the 1950s. And so in keeping with that period, medical care, while provided to all, was delivered in segregated facilities. Mrs. Lax was diagnosed with cervical cancer in January of 1951. During her radiation treatment, a sample of her tumor and of healthy cervical tissue was removed. As best as we understand it, these samples were not removed as part of Mrs. Lax's clinical care, but rather for research purposes. In keeping with the practice of the time, Mrs. Lax's consent for the removal of the tissue sample and for its use in research was never obtained. In October of 1951, Mrs. Lax died in Johns Hopkins Hospital, never knowing of the extraordinary breakthrough in science that her tissue sample enabled. Her children did not learn of the existence of HeLa cells or that the cells were being bought, sold, and used in research until 20 years later. For many years, the identity of the source of HeLa cells was unknown or misrepresented as Helen Lane. When Henrietta Lax's identity was made public, initially in 1971, this was without her family's authorization. Indeed, they were never notified about their wife's and mother's role in science, let alone that her name was about to be released to the world. Mrs. Lax's family never received any financial compensation. Her children grew up in poverty, and especially in their early years, in sometimes desperate circumstances. Next slide, please. So much of the conversation about the ethical issues that Mrs. Lax's experience and her family's experience and HeLa cells have raised have turned on debates and conversations about consent and compensation. Next slide, please. Now, there are incredibly important questions about consent and compensation that the HeLa cell story illustrates and that continue to be extremely important and to some extent unresolved for biosample science generally. But in my view, and certainly for the framing of this panel, the consent and compensation issues, while very important from the standpoint of the ethics of science, are not the main reasons why we are ethically troubled, deeply troubled by the experience of Mrs. Lax and her family. Next slide, please. For me, the prime animating moral concerns have to do with justice, and justice has everything to do with it. Next slide, please. I want us now to consider two, what I call here, counterfactuals. Two propositions counter to fact that I think help express why I feel justice considerations are so central to a moral analysis of this experience. Here's the first counterfactual. What if Mrs. Lax's family had received substantial compensation from the commercialization of her cells? So let's assume there had been a lot of money that had come to the Lax family eventually. It would never have come in time to affect the lives of Mrs. Lax's children in their early years. But let's assume it came. Would the story of Mrs. Lax and her family, would it still be morally troubling? That's the first counterfactual. And the second counterfactual is, what if the details of the story were exactly as we've come to understand it, especially through Rebecca Skloot's compelling book? What if the details had been exactly as Rebecca Skloot relays them? No consent, no compensation. But Mrs. Lax had been an affluent, well-educated white person whose family had excellent health insurance and was economically secure. Would their story be as morally troubling, and why? Now, my answer to the first question is, even with compensation, the story of Mrs. Lax and her family and the Gila cell line would still be morally troubling. And my answer to the second question is no. If Mrs. Lax had been a well-educated, well-off white woman, and her family similarly so, while there would be ethically problematic issues having to do with their experience, it would not be anywhere near as morally troubling as was the actual case. Next slide, please. Justice, or rather injustice, is what is behind the worst of what happened. Now, in bioethics, we are very accustomed to talking about questions of distributive justice. And at a first glance, you could look at the experience of Mrs. Lax through the typical sort of framing of distributive justice in biomedical research and say, well, what's going on here? This was not a context unlike the Tuskegee Syphilis study, many others in the pantheon of really egregious cases in the history of biomedical research, in which the burdens of research were disproportionately placed on disadvantaged groups, individuals, and the benefits less so. In this particular case, the tissue samples were being taken from white patients and black patients, from wealthy patients and poor patients, without consent, without compensation. The risks or the burdens of the removing of the tissue while present were not overwhelming, but it's just sort of not the typical context in which we see tremendous risks and burdens being imposed on poor people and benefit for society generally. The kinds of justice issues that are engaged in the experience of Mrs. Lax and her family have more to do with questions of structural or social justice than questions of distributive justice. Next slide, please. What do I mean by structural injustice? For me, structural theories of justice share one overarching assumption. It is the assumption that social arrangements, including institutions and social practices, have highly consequential, differential, and unjust effects on individuals because they are members of identifiable social groups. Structural injustice or structural justice considerations turn on the ways in which differently situated social groups are treated in society. Next slide, please. Structural racism is a particularly pernicious form of structural injustice. There are many ways to illustrate how structural racism is reinforced and continuously supported by a web of interrelated legal, economic, normative values, practices, regulations, laws, all of which serve to make it extremely difficult, in some cases even impossible, for members of racially defined groups to have lives that are as likely to go well as those of people in privileged groups, more powerful groups. We can cash this out in terms of the origins of segregated housing, the reconcentration of poverty, all kinds of practices intended to limit the potential for wealth accumulation within African American families, for example, predatory lending practices directed at disadvantaged people, and so on. The arena where it's most evident right now to most Americans is the institutionally structured dynamics in policing that continue to keep African American people and other people of color at a distinct disadvantage. This quote is from James Baldwin from a very compelling essay that was written in 1966 called Report from Occupied Territory. And in this quote, right, I just want to draw your attention to the last lines. Harlem is a stand-in for the African American community. Harlem believes, and this is, of course, from Baldwin, and I completely agree, Baldwin, completely agree, that these laws are directed against Negroes. They are certainly not directed against anybody else. That is the sort of force of structural injustice. Next slide, please. To spend a bit more on time on the features of structural injustice. Groups that are at the disadvantaged end, groups that are experiencing structural injustice, experience diminished prospects for well-being and indeed diminished quality of life. Their human rights are typically either completely unfulfilled or they are underprotected. Pretty much every dimension of what makes life go well is affected. Health, knowledge and understanding, personal security, being treated with equal respect, self-determination, being able to have functional personal attachments, families and friends, all affected by structural injustice patterns. Disadvantage. If you think of life as anything like analogous to a game, the level playing field does not exist in a context of structural injustice. Some groups start life way ahead of the starting line, and other groups start life way behind the starting line. That's just a defining characteristic of structural injustice as it plays out in people's lives. Power in society is not experienced similarly by different socially situated groups. Some groups have a lot of social control, other groups very little. Some groups decide who gets to be included, other groups are excluded. And economic exploitation goes along with all of this picture. So the powerful groups, the advantaged groups, the groups whose rights are protected, these are the groups that are positioned to benefit disproportionately, economically and otherwise, but economically, by essentially exploiting those groups who have less power, who are behind in terms of advantages, and whose life prospects are so poor, so diminished, that they are willing to work in contexts where other people are not. Last slide. Thank you. So what I want to submit for your consideration in terms of thinking about those two counterfactuals is that Mrs. Lax and her family in the early 1950s into the 1950s as the stories as the family story unfolds, they were, right, inextricably interdependent with the structural injustice that was the background of the experience of African Americans then and sadly still now. What is wrong about what happened to the Lax family engages every core element of human well-being. There were assaults on the social bases of respect, and of self-determination, on cognition and attachment, on personal security, and on health. Mrs. Lax and her children were poor Black people in a segregated world in which the most profound injustices of racial oppression were daily features of their lives. One child with developmental disabilities and a seizure disorder spent most of her short life in an awful segregated institution. The other siblings suffered regular hunger and regular abuse without any interference from Child Protective Services. So while it is important to think about consent and compensation, as we consider the lessons of the experience of Mrs. Lax and the HeLa cell line development, it would be a terrible moral mistake not to remember always the background conditions of structural injustice, of structural racism, that defined pretty much every way in which this story unfolded. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth, for setting out the issue so clearly and so powerfully. Our next panelist is Jerry Lax Y. We're really thrilled to have Jerry with us today. Jerry Lax is Henrietta Lax's granddaughter. She works at the judiciary system of Baltimore in the domestic violence unit for her professional life. But really important for our conversation today, Jerry has visited dozens of campuses and communities, sharing her perspective on the legacy of her grandmother, Henrietta Lax, and HeLa cells. She continues to keep her grandmother's legacy alive while using her family's story as a platform to address national issues of the most pressing nature at the moment, and always, I would say, unfortunately for the last decades, around preventive health care, health disparities, literacy, and community trust. Jerry is one of 3 family members on the NIH panel that oversees the research involving the HeLa genome and its applications, and she was also among the family members who consulted on the HBO film adaptation of The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lax, produced by Oprah Winfrey and Alan Ball. Jerry, so thrilled to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the great introduction. And thank you, Dr. Faden, for that wonderful overview of Henrietta Lax. And speaking about social justice, social injustice, I just want to start a poem that I wrote about my grandmother. And it was just my way of honoring my grandmother and educating people about her story. And the poem is entitled, Who Am I? As you gain knowledge, all will become clear. You ask, who am I? Be a daughter, wife, mother, or friend. I am just an ordinary woman, a wife to my husband, mother to my children, and a friend to the world. I became ill and departed this earth at an early age. Through my death, I became a medical treasure. I am the one who became immortal. Yes, the first immortal human cell line. Say the word everlasting. Read about me. I am the one who helped Dr. Jonas Salks. Yes, him and I saved millions of lives by creating the polio vaccine, the disease that had killed and sickened millions of children in the 1950s. Say the words. Say the word immunization. Read about me. I am the one who was at the right place at the right time when a scientist actually poured a chemical on me. Yes, to their surprise, humans have 46 chromosomes in the human body, not 48. Say the word genetic diagnosis. Read about me. I am growing indefinitely, frozen for decades, shared among scientists, and remain the most widely used cell line in biomedical research. Say the word divide and conquer. I am the one who's in you and you in me. Did you get vaccinated for the polio? Did you get in vitro fertilization? Receive radiation treatments or medication for cancer? Took medicine for HIV? Received the vaccine for HPV? Yes, I am the one who helped thee. I was snipped and placed in a petri dish, which I really did not know. I am constantly helping mankind from the very first day I departed this earth, which I really did not know. I became intriguing to the medical world, which I really did not know. Even though the world lacks, LACKS, the full understanding of who I am, time gives us the opportunity to gain or lose all that I have done, and everywhere I have been, the world will gain knowledge through the telling of my story. I am Henrietta Lacks, responsible for the masterpiece, Healer Cells. And I read about me, and I wrote this, it was just my way of continuing to educate people about my grandmother's life and her legacy. Our family uses her story as a platform to speak about social justice, to speak about health equity, speak about literacy, speak about poverty, homelessness. I mean, it's just so many conversations that we can have when it comes to our grandmother's story. And we just want to be a part of the change. We want to make change. We want to see real changes. I mean, we have to think better to do better. Our family, continues to preserve and honor and educate people about Henrietta's story. So many people still don't know her story, and we just want to make sure that everyone knows her tremendous contributions to science, to biomedical research. I mean, her cells are essential in the polio vaccine, medication for HIV and AIDS. She was responsible for treatment for certain diseases. She assisted with in vitro fertilization. And when I say in vitro fertilization, she was able to give life. Couples who are unable to conceive are now able to start a family through in vitro fertilization. So when I look at my grandmother's story and see that she helped with in vitro fertilization, I look at her as a person who continues to give life, continues to preserve life in so many ways. I mean, it's just amazing just to continue to listen and to learn about our grandmother's story and how she is continuing to help mankind, and not only just a specific group, but just everybody, no matter what your gender, your sex, your race, your social economics, you have benefited from the healer cells. And she she saved countless lives and her cells have generated millions, let me say billions of dollars, and her family still has not seen any revenue or any type of medical benefits, particularly her offsprings. And I just the Lacks family just tried to do our part in making sure that Henrietta's story is not forgotten, and that she is a special lady who has taken part in a lot of medical breakthroughs. And we just want to make sure that she just gets her recognition, that people actually honor her. And we just want to thank Deborah, my Aunt Deborah, and Rebecca Skloot for actually writing the book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, because it amplified Henrietta's story. I mean, it was books and documentaries out there, but the Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks took her story to a different level. And we just, grateful for their journey. And this is the Lacks family's journey now, just trying to continue our grandmother's story. I just want to the healer cells are just amazing. And, until this day, laboratories are using her cells to continue to study the human life and to study diseases. And from our understanding, is used for the COVID. So we hope and pray that, she be able to come up with a vaccine. She can't help with the vaccine, with the polio and the HPV. So you never know. She might help with the pandemic, the COVID-19. So I just want to, this is just another platform for our family to continue the conversation of our grandmother's story. Our grandmother recently turned 100 years old, August the 1st, and the family celebrated her 100th birthday with a Healer 100 symposium, virtual symposium. It was supposed to be a 3-day conference in Baltimore, Maryland, but because of the pandemic, we had to kind of shift gears and do a virtual symposium because we definitely wanted to make sure that we honored her 100th birthday. We had a great group of panelists that spoke about Henrietta Lacks and spoke about social justice, spoke about health equity. It was Dr. Francis Collins, Helen Wilson Rowe from United Kingdom. We had Dr. Ruha Benjamin. She's a professor at Princeton University. We had the author Rebecca Skloot, and David and my brother David and I were on a panel as well. And it was a family effort that we came together to honor our grandmother and just to make sure we keep the conversation going. And, we want to keep the conversation going by collaborating with different organizations throughout the year until 2021 to honor our grandmother and to speak about certain issues that we are facing as a nation. And I guess, just wanted, just make sure that Henrietta is not forgotten, and she just gave unknowingly. And I think Henrietta is a gift that she didn't know that she was a gift that keeps on giving. And I just want to make sure we never forget, her as an African-American woman who was a mother, who was a wife, who was a friend to the world, and to honor her contributions to science.
Thank you, Jerry.
You're welcome.
We always learn a lot from you and from story of your grandmother, and happy 100th birthday. It was a lovely tribute. I had the opportunity to join, so it was great to see all of the celebration and remarks. Next we have a speaker who's coming from a somewhat different perspective, and maybe to set this up just a little bit, ASBH, of course, is bioethics and humanities. And so we thought for this panel it would be useful to bring in a little bit of the humanities perspective. And to do that, we invited Victor Vines, who is an architect. And just before I introduce him, say, to share his perspective about what it means to bring the story of a name and a reason for a building into design. And I'll tell you why that's important to this story in a second. Victor Vines is the president and founder of Vines Architecture, and he has spent 34 years producing really incredible and culturally impactful design projects. He studied architecture at North Carolina State University, and he's a member of the American Institute of Architects and the National Organization of Minority Architects. Important for the panel today, prior to his launching his own firm, he was the vice president of the Freelon Group, and in that capacity worked to lead and manage the programming and planning phase of the Smithsonian Institution National Museum of African American History and Culture. I've got to know Victor, I think of as a friend and colleague in the process, because he is leading the design for a building that will be on the Johns Hopkins East Baltimore campus, adjacent to our current home, Deering Hall of the Berman Institute of Bioethics, which will be named for Henrietta Lacks. And so Victor and Jerry and David and members of the East Baltimore community have been working in the early phase of a design project that will realize a building on the Johns Hopkins campus named for Mrs. Lacks. So with that, sorry, over a long introduction, but I thought important to set the stage. Welcome, Victor, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be here on the panel with everyone. I'm honored to speak a little bit on the topic that Jeff has mentioned regarding social justice and injustice that we're dealing with today, primarily through the perspective and the lens of architecture and design, and sort of how I view the discipline that I work in and profession that I work in, responding and addressing this very important topic. I want to start first off a little bit with sort of just in general about how our practice looks at the design profession and what I believe is our responsibility in how we do our work, particularly on certain projects like the Henrietta Lacks building that'll be provided and designed for the Johns Hopkins campus. I think first and foremost, our firm, which is it's important for me to acknowledge, is not just me. I happen to work with a great group of wonderful people, designers, architects that help us together envision the projects and the type of work that we do. But in general, we try to understand first and foremost that each project and each design that we provide has its own sort of unique DNA that addresses a specific calling for each of these important projects and structures. I often say that, it's pretty simple to do a building from a design perspective. It's a lot more difficult to turn that into architecture, and particularly architecture of significance. And what we try to understand is, what exactly is so special about this project in this place, and what responsibilities does it have in serving the community and the users. So, I want to mention a few projects that I've been a part of in the past, and then I'll end up with talking specifically about sharing some thoughts about the Henrietta Lacks building that we have been planning and programming to date. So, I was fortunate enough to work and lead the design of the International Civil Rights Center and Museum in Greensboro, North Carolina. This project is the location of the Woolworth building, where the 4 students from NC State University initiated the sit-in movement, in at least a portion in North Carolina. And I was approached by the building owner and the client to basically look at what would we do with the building. And one of the things I quickly recognized and conveyed to everyone is that as they were thinking about turning that into a museum, which is essentially what the project type is now, that unlike most museums that house sort of unique artifacts and specific artifacts for an experience, that what was unique about this project and this site and the opportunity for it was that the most precious artifact itself was the building, because the building was essentially the place that something of significance took part, which was obviously the 4 students refusing to leave the lunch counter prior to being served. And so that specific point of view led us into the direction of not just looking at how you can take a building and house artifacts, but how does the building itself convey the message of importance and what actually took place there. And so A few years later, that project became more of a restoration of the place as opposed to a renovation to house certain things that should take place in the museum. It does do both, but it was probably one of the more unique special projects that I've been a part of. And I think now, even more importantly, what we're finding is that these facilities and places become tremendous learning and teaching opportunities for the message that clearly needs to be addressed more so now than anything, and that's the sort of social injustices that are taking place. And so I think you're going to see that these facilities do have significant relevance. They do have a responsibility to tell a certain message. And from the designers and architects' point of view, we have a responsibility to convey how that actually happens in the narrative. The other sort of project I wanted to talk about, Jeff mentioned the programming. It was actually what was called Phase 1, the programming and planning and envisioning of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which I led the team for that phase of the project, working with, once again, a wonderful group of others in doing so. And one of the more important aspects of that project was, once again, how does one take such a sort of heroic opportunity and actually deliver what should be in a museum for African Americans, conveying its history and culture, which is a monumental task in itself. And if anyone knows anything about that project, it has been a tremendous success. But the success has been mainly because of the countless number of individuals that came together to make that project a reality. And coming together was not a simple or easy feat. The firm I work with, which I was blessed to work with, the late Phil Freelon, which basically envisioned that project at the beginning, and working with Max Bond and others, countless others, envisioning what that project could be. I think the thing that came out of it was how do you bring a large group of very, very talented individuals together to collaborate in order to create a single vision that hopefully would be received well by hundreds of thousands of people as they come to that facility and understand, once again, what the African American culture and history is about. So not taking any of these responsibilities lightly, that was a critical turning point in my career as it relates to how architecture and design can influence and inform in a very, very positive way, in a very, very powerful and impactful way. So if I fast forward and talk a bit about the Henrietta Lacks building opportunity, Vines was selected to plan and program and design a building that would be on the Johns Hopkins University campus that would represent the story and the legacy of Henrietta Lacks. And so one of the things that was probably the most important thing for us coming into the project was understanding who the family was, who Henrietta Lacks was through the family members that we were fortunate enough to be able to engage with. And so we spent a tremendous amount of time not even thinking about architecture, not even thinking about design, not thinking about buildings, but thinking about the people that this narrative would try to tell a story around. And unfortunately, we didn't have the individual, Miss Lacks, to engage with, but we did have a loving family that was able to share and allow us into their world to get a glimpse of who this person was. And the truth of the matter is they didn't have to do that. and it's something that we probably hold in the highest regard when it comes to sort of how we trust each other, even if we don't necessarily know each other so well at the beginning. That for me was, first of all, gaining their confidence and then earning their trust, not necessarily assuming that we can be trustworthy. So for me, the trust is about earning. So when we started that project, myself and Bob Thomas, my design partner, talked a lot about, not about architecture, not about design, not about what the building could be, but what is the narrative and what that story is that we want to tell through the building. And so, as I mentioned, meeting with the Lax family was critically important. It was also important how we met. Some were official meetings and presentations, but the more impactful ones were when we would talk either after the meetings or through other more informal engagements of really trying to understand and know who these folks are, what they went through, what they cared about, and what mattered to them more than anything. And then in doing so, it was then our responsibility to then say, okay, well, the building still has to house and have a certain function. So that meant that we also had this sort of multi-headed client where we said, okay, we need to also understand the Berman Institute, which will essentially reside in the building, and what their needs are. And what are going to be the expectations from their point of view. The other thing we discovered was that there was actually a third sort of client, if you want to call it that, and that was the East Baltimore community. Because at the end of the day, this university and this building on this university resides within the community. And that community was either going to be expected to embrace this approach to the project or perhaps not. And so once again, we found ourselves back to having confidence and earning trust with people within the community that we perhaps did not have a long history with. And so that similar process of understanding and engaging with the community and their needs was critically important in understanding what would inform this project and its architecture. So that was sort of the recipe that was created for the project. And then we went off to work and developed what we believe right now is a very, very sound program that will basically house the Berman Institute program requirements. But instead of just putting the name of Henrietta Lacks on the building, understanding when you drive by this building and you see this building, you might not know exactly where you are, but if you see it, you would go, that's the Henrietta Lacks building. And once you engage in the building and experiencing it, understanding and learning about the life of Henrietta Lacks, the person of Henrietta Lacks, her contribution to the medical and health community, and also understanding more and more about bioethics and how those two blend themselves together. So not only will we build a building of a certain number of floors and a certain number of square footages, but we will also create a narrative and an experience in the building that all of those things will be expressed. And hopefully when you come and leave, you will be more informed about this wonderful lady and her contribution and her legacy, and how that has basically been embraced by the university. So we're terribly excited about the continuation of it. We can't wait to continue with the design phases of the project as we are getting ready to do so. And, it really is about earning the trust and then conveying that narrative within the architecture and design.
Thank you, Victor. And, I'm sure people listening and seeing you can understand why we're so excited to be working with you. I can see Jerry's face and the big smile about, just hearing you talk brings us back to being together when we were able to do that and talking about your vision and how excited we all are. And we hope, maybe just to put a little point on this, to get started again in the design. And we will, of course, be very proudly public about the groundbreaking ceremony and the eventual opening in a few years, and hope that many of the folks who are watching today will be able to join us for that. The last member of our panel probably needs little introduction to this audience, but I will do so anyway, and that is Professor Patricia King, who is Professor of Law Emeritus at Georgetown University Law Center. She also holds an adjunct professorship in the Department of Health Policy and Management in the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. She is well known, I'm sure, to most, if not all of you, a member of the National Academy of Medicine, the American Law Institute, a fellow of the Hastings Center, and a faculty affiliate of the Georgetown University Kennedy Institute of Ethics. Importantly for today, her scholarship focuses on race and genomics, racial disparities, and health and reproductive health, among other areas. She served on numerous really landmark advisory bodies at the national level that were formed to address ethical issues in science, technology, research, and biomedicine, including the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research, which of course we all know is the National Commission, which produced the Belmont Report. She also was a member of of President Clinton's Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, which was chaired by Ruth Faden. She was a member of the National Institutes of Health Embryo Research Panel and the NIH Recombinant DNA Advisory Committee. Her work really spans nearly the entirety of modern academic bioethics, and it's really a privilege to have her share her thoughts, looking back, I think, on the work that she has done and where we are at this moment as we address the issues of today's panel. So thank you, Pat.
Thank you, Jeff. It's such an honor to be included in this group, and it's a real special honor to be in the same place with the granddaughter of Henrietta Lacks. I just loved her presentation. I first encountered the story of Henrietta Lacks and her life and her cells in the writings of sociologist Hannah Landecker, who was interested in the history of tissue culture and the transformation of human body cells into modern technologies. I later read Rebecca Scoot's book and learned more about Henrietta Lacks's life, her family, and the use of her cells. Society's use of her cells has revolutionized science and raised many ethical issues that resonate in other contexts today, including, for example, ownership of biological materials and protection of individual and family privacy. Notably for me and for others, her life story also casts light on the ongoing legacy of slavery and the burdens that Black Americans continue to experience in their interactions with health providers and health institutions. I was a child when Henrietta Lacks went to Johns Hopkins Hospital for treatment. Her life story resonates personally with me because it reflects many of my own early experiences. We were both Black and female, and that intersectionality carries burdens of its own. Both of us were born and spent our early childhoods in segregated Virginia. On occasion, we both had to seek health care outside of segregated communities. Though Norfolk, Virginia, where I lived in the 1940s and 50s, was large enough to have its own Black hospital. We both encountered racism in health institutions. I lived in segregated housing until I left for college in 1959. When I was 6 years old, my parents separated. 2 months after the separation, my father was placed in a tuberculosis sanatorium, a segregated sanatorium, an early form of containment for infectious disease. In later life, after hearing others describe their confinement in these institutions, I just decided that I could not imagine how my father had survived, though I have been told that he may not have been accurately diagnosed. He was released many years later after antibiotics arrived, and I was in my teens. After he was diagnosed with TB, my mother, my sister, and I were required to regularly receive TB skin tests and chest x-rays. There was only one public health clinic for these activities in Norfolk, and it served Blacks and whites who were carefully segregated. But the waiting time was always longer for Blacks. Gender segregation, at least on the Black side of the facility, was not nearly so meticulously adhered to. On one such occasion, when I was a preteen, I found myself in a small room with men and women. We were dressed waist up with a paper covering, waiting to be called for our x-rays. I felt such humiliation and such shame. I'm sure being a preteen had something to do with my reaction. But as a young girl, I also had a hard time comprehending why racial segregation was more salient than any other factor, including gender and other concerns. I did not want to return ever again. The following year, I begged my mother not to make me return. She carefully explained that there was no money to pay for a private physician. More importantly, if we did not go back, we would be evicted from our public housing. So I went. But I did not understand why where I lived was a factor in my health care. I thought I should have been treated in the same manner as people who rented or owned homes, who had relatives diagnosed with tuberculosis. My mother was wonderful. She understood my anguish and humiliation. In a few years, she somehow found the money to send me to a private physician, while she and my sister went back to the city public health clinic. This was one experience my mother could not protect me from. This was one experience she could protect me from, but she couldn't protect me from all the other segregated waiting rooms of white doctors when it was necessary to see a specialist, or all the other humiliating experiences involved with seeking health care. They have all left their mark, and they sometimes interfere with my own interactions with healthcare providers and health institutions. I know I'm not alone. Many other Black Americans have similar negative experiences with health providers and health institutions. Our narratives are important and should be thought of as lessons or homework for individuals and institutions, because they not only document deep distress we bring to our health encounters, but also convey other relevant aspects of our lives that should be appreciated. Moreover, we Black Americans risk harm to ourselves because of our distrust and the possibility that it constitutes an impediment to seeking timely health care, vaccinations, or participating in other activities that are important to our well-being. Black Americans should participate in clinical trials, not only for the possibility for personal health, but also for the greater good that participation might help reduce racial disparities in health. It's also critical that providers and researchers on the one hand, and patients and communities on the other, work to build additional trust going forward. This is only going to happen if the experiences of marginalized groups and individuals are understood and incorporated, not just superficially, but meaningfully into the norms, decision-making, and education of health providers and health institutions. Inclusion helps to recognize the dignity of all persons touched by these institutions. And importantly, it will make these institutions more effective in their respective missions. Henrietta Lacks' story is also a reminder of the Tuskegee syphilis study, in which Black men unknowingly went untreated, all in the name of science. The Tuskegee study raises additional issues beyond distrust, inclusion, and partnership that perhaps is most visible in the disproportionate impact of the current COVID-19 pandemic on Black Americans. In 1972, I was the deputy director of the Office for Civil Rights in the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare when the Tuskegee syphilis study was revealed. To the extent possible, I followed the activities of the ad hoc advisory panel, conveniently lodged in the department, that was established to investigate what had occurred. I was heartened by the panel's judgment that in retrospect, the study was unethically justified in 1932 because the men did not give consent. But I was dismayed by the inadequate attention paid to the context in which the study was carried out. I wondered why the study was conducted with a poor population in the Deep South, a region of the country populated by those who deeply believed that Blacks and whites were biologically different and whites were superior, and where Black folks often lacked access to education, employment, and basic health care. My life experience, and indeed my cynicism, also led me to ask, what if the researchers had solicited consent? Would that have made the study ethical? I don't think so. Since the 1970s, the complexities of the Tuskegee syphilis study have been thoroughly researched, discussed, debated, and its lessons continue to inform us down to the present. But the piece that I like best about the Tuskegee study was written by historian Alan Brandt and published in the Hastings Center Report in 1978. He placed the Tuskegee syphilis story in its historical context and assessed the ethical implications. In a few minutes, I hope you will understand why I believe context and uncovering history is critical in assessing ethical issues where Black folks and perhaps others are involved. As I mentioned earlier, our ongoing experiences with the COVID-19 pandemic continues to expose the depth of the virus's disparate impact on people of color. Significantly, the disparate impact illuminates the many ways the nation's racist past practices have been built into the nation's social and economic systems, deep underlying inequities that still persist and contradict our ideals of justice and equality. For example, the pandemic makes clear that for Black Americans, the link between place, where we live, and health and exposure to the virus go well beyond the connection of my youth between public housing and segregated public health clinics. Understanding the narratives of Henrietta Lacks, myself, and many others is the first step in understanding the deeply ingrained institutional practices, biases, and beliefs that are still at work in our health systems. The lawyer and civil rights activist Bryan Stevenson puts it succinctly. He says, "Slavery didn't end in 1865. It just evolved." We all need to know how it evolved. It's not enough to viscerally imagine ourselves in the shoes of others who have been discriminated against. More is required. So in understanding how we have evolved, we need to do several things. First, collectively, we need to know how we got to this place. In other words, we need to know our history. As one scholar put it, we must begin thinking about race as a social construct with different meanings changing over time, and as a relationship rather than a variable. We need to focus on the context, the institutions, the policies, and changing economic forces acting over time that have brought us to the present. Henrietta Lacks's narrative is so important and critical because to a large extent, understanding this narrative does this, especially since the narrative continues to evolve and to be memorialized. Second, we need to accept that racial disparities in health and healthcare are not natural. They have been created, and thus they can be changed. And finally, we must be motivated to dismantle, modify, or correct ingrained structural impediments that people of color face in accessing healthcare and improving their overall health status. Thank you for having me here. And thanks to the rest of you.
Thank you, Pat. It was incredibly powerful. And as I was listening, and I'm sure as others will agree, it made me think that we are fortunate to be doing the panel this way, to capture that in a recording to share with others for posterity. So thank you so much for that very personal and very compelling commentary. I'm not quite speechless, but maybe close. So let me thank you, along with the three others, all four of you, for a really, I'd say, remarkable and wonderful collection of commentaries, and it fit together, I think, in a really interesting and important and powerful way. So thanks again, and thank you all for attending.
Hello, I am Tom.
Hi, everybody. Nice to be live with you. That was as powerful, I think, in the rewatching the recording as it was when we did it in real time. You may have seen in the chat that Thomas indicated that Jerry Lax is unable to be here. Unfortunately, they've had a death in the Lax family, and so we send our condolences to her and the rest of the Lax family, and she's not able to be with us here. We have just 5 minutes left in the session, so I want to go as quickly as we can to some of the questions that you've been posing, and maybe I'll combine them together in a way that fits with one that I had wanted to ask of our panelists. So I think there's a theme that's coming through about whether justice has been served in the story of the Lax family. And you've all talked in some way about sort of how we got to where we are. Pat, you did that very clearly. And, you know, clearly we have not done enough yet in many of the ways that you all have articulated. So maybe I'll just leave it and ask you all, what can we be doing more than we have? Have the Lax family been served in terms of justice? And, you know, I had asked in advance of this in case we needed a seed question, but I'll ask it here because it all kind of fits together. We have been talking about this for a long time. We're in a moment of particular history we're living through, of course. And I wonder what you would say about, you know, what I've already posed to you, and then looking forward, let's say 5 years from now, we came together again in the same venue. What do you hope is different from the perspective of the comments that you made? And maybe we'll just go in the order in which you each presented your initial talk. So Ruth first, then Victor, and then Pat.
Thanks, Jeff. I will try to be super brief. And of course, it's really very unfortunate for the reason that Jerry is not with us, but Jerry, of course, would be the best person to speak to the question of whether the Lax family feels that to some extent, justice is being served by the recent responses to the story of Mrs. Lax. I would say on that point, from my interactions with many of the members of the Lax family over the years, and they are just extraordinary people, as Victor has already referenced and Jeff knows as well, that while there are many ways to slice into the question of whether the family has been justly treated over time, my clear sense is that what is most important to the family is that Mrs. Lax's legacy not be forgotten. That is her personal legacy, that she is not forgotten as a human being and as a person. And I think there are a lot of policies in place right now, including the NIH policy that we would talk about if we had more time, that are intentionally designed to that effect. Naming the building and having the building be designed the way Victor has described it will go a long way to that. But the family is passionately committed, and I feel weird speaking for them, but I know this matters tremendously to them. There are lots of other ways to slice into what justice requires, but the sort of erasing of Mrs. Lax from the story and erasing the family from the story was a big part of what made this so wrong-making, so disrespectful. And that finally has shifted in very significant ways in recent years. Over the next 5 years, I don't know, I'm torn, Jeff. On the one hand, I put up that quote from James Baldwin, which was over 50 years ago, and we can look and say, gosh, how little has changed. On the other hand, we can do the other side and say, so much has changed in the past 50 years, but what can change in 5 years? So really quickly, a lot turns on whether this experience that we're living through now really is the inflection point that some commentators have argued, some historians and other people who've reflected on this space, civil rights advocates and others have said this might be. I'll just be political for 10 seconds. If we get a different administration, and if we get a different composition in the House, there are some very important pieces of legislation, the Voting Rights Act, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, that have a chance of passing and being one of those times in which the new Voting Rights Act and this new Policing Act might make some real difference within 5 years, with real impact that goes past those 5 years. I also would like to think that the experience that we've been going through just recently, calling attention to what has been there for a very long time, may be one of those cultural moments as well, where it's not only law and policy that will change, but cultural attitudes and hearts that are changing as well. And so I'd like to be optimistic about or having something else to say in 2025, other than repeating it, the Baldwin quote again.
Okay, we'll hold you to it. Victor, briefly too, please.
Thank you, Jeff. Well, Ruth talked a lot about the importance of how we can address the building of Henrietta Lacks. The key word for me right now is as we look at in the next 5 years, how that building can be done with authenticness. And you know, the narrative and the story and the memorialization of her and her legacy must be done accurately and authentic. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's all about the sort of glory and positive aspects of things. It's about being truthful about what occurred and being able to convey that in the narrative and the experience of the building. You know, one of the wonderful things about architecture is that if it's done well, these are facilities of some permanence. And so the memorialization of her and her legacy through architecture and a building honoring her within the next 5 years would be fantastic. And regarding the social injustice and humanities, I do believe that we're at a pivotal point to not necessarily have to agree on everything, but I think the evidence is pretty overwhelming at this point about the injustices that are going on. And I think you have to be truthful about that evidence and at least acknowledge that we have problems that need to be addressed, and to not necessarily agree on all the problems, but at least agree that addressing the problems is the right thing to do. And I think that's a pretty hard argument for people to take and say, okay, we're just going to assume none of this is really